And I'm very honored indeed to introduce the first expert session, the keynote speech of this series. I'm very honored really, and I've listened also to her speech already, and I really advise you, she has a wonderful kick-off for this whole event series and a lot of talking points that we could really think about. And who is she? She is Professor Dr. Azza Karam. She is Secretary General of Religions of Peace and Professor of Religion and Development at the Vrije Universiteit in Amsterdam. In the past, she held various positions at the United Nations. Amongst others, she was the coordinator and the chair of the United Nations Interagency Task Force on Religion and Development, and she was president of the Committee of Religious NGOs at the United Nations. And I welcome her. I thank her very much for her participation from afar. And I welcome you also to listen to this kick-off of the event series that we are going to watch in the coming weeks.
Peace be upon you, one and all. Good day, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time of day it is. I am extraordinarily humbled and honored to be able to have joined you this way. I will tell you very, very honestly that I used to be one of those people who would complain incessantly about how I was conferenced out, tired of conferences. Well, I'll tell you something. God has taught me a very humbling lesson. I would love to see people again and to be together with people again. I so miss the opportunity to meet, to assemble, to be together. And I'm therefore grateful that you've allowed me to be in this space, and I just wish I could actually be with all of you. I think we're all readjusting to this very complicated space where we have to be together without actually being together. And we will continue to learn. This is such a lifelong learning process. So I am asked to reflect a little bit with you on the experiences of working inside the United Nations system on and with religion, the story of that work very briefly, then also sharing with you some of my perceptions about some of the challenges of doing this work, of working with different religious communities and actors inside a international policy space, which the UN is, or at least I was serving a role in UN headquarters, so I was not in the practical service delivery at country level. I was talking about partnerships and doing partnerships at the headquarter level. So that's the limits of my experience. So, experience working in the UN, some of the challenges and the lessons in that space, over 20 years almost, and some reflections with you on how religion could potentially be a very positive force for change, especially in and for women in conflict dynamics. These are my instructions from the esteemed colleagues who put this event together, to which I would like to share my hat. It is timely, it is relevant, it is a necessary discussion. Let me share with you a little bit what I did in the UN system, very, very briefly. When I first joined the United Nations in 2004, I joined United Nations Development Programme, or UNDP, where it was made very clear within the first week that, and I quote, "we don't do religion." And I must confess, I'm still somewhat flummoxed by why anybody would think it was possible to do any development work on governance, on human rights, on peace and security, which were part of UNDP's agenda then, without doing religion. I always thought that was an absolutely marvelous statement. I wanted to know how they did it. Apparently they've been doing it for many, many years. But anyway, that was my own weakness and clearly my own naivety. In 2007, end of 2007, I joined the United Nations Population Fund, where, because they were working on sexual and reproductive health and reproductive rights issues, otherwise referred to as SRHR, but because they were working on these issues in over 100 countries as UNFPA, they apparently, some of them, if not most of them, who were based in country, realized that they had no option but to somehow come to terms with religious actors, religious arguments, religious opposition. So there was a lot of learning inside the system about the need to engage with different religious actors that was somehow waiting to be tapped, if you will, inside UNFPA. But then I made a very interesting discovery, which is that actually every single UN entity that is developmental in nature, that serves the development and humanitarian mandate, which is actually most of the UN Development Group countries, entities, that actually most of them had country experience of engaging with religion and religious actors, but it was just the folks in HQ, in headquarters, in Geneva, Vienna, Rome, New York, who were not interested in knowing about what that particular legacy of learning and experience was. So a large part of what had to happen within the UN system in order to eliminate the very real bias about knowing about religion and working with religion, a large part of what had to happen was, one, to actually learn a little bit better what was going on in our own institutions, because the UN is very protective. Each entity is very protective and jealous of its own territoriality. Shocking. We had to learn about what our own entities were up to in different countries. We also had to humanize the religious actors, because usually they were perceived as particular men in robes who always had something negative to say about women and women's roles in society, and heaven forbid we should ever get into the other identities that exist on this good earth. So we needed to humanize our religious counterparts in the humanitarian and development arena. So together with a number of different UN entities, we came together to form the UN Interagency Task Force. And that was really a safe space inside the UN system where we could come together from different UN entities and share our own experiences of working with religious actors, understandings of religion and what it meant and who are these religious people. But also, quite frankly, with the passage of time, it also became a space to not only learn from one another, but to work together with some of the same religious actors. Obviously, to define what we meant by religious actors, by engagement, so it was the process of understanding, but also the process of partnerships. This became what the UN Interagency Task Force committed to doing and to serving together. It became a safe space inside the UN system to keep each other better informed about the realms of religion, which we realized far, far outweighed the entire UN system. In the process of learning from one another, we developed a particular modality called the Strategic Learning Exchange. So we would convene with our colleagues, the program officers, the policy advisors in different religious NGOs, with whom some of our country officers were working anyway already. But we would convene them and share experiences and learnings. And my keenness at that time was to ensure that we were convening religious NGOs as opposed to religious leaders. The reason is very simple. Religious leaders have their own institutions. And quite frankly, when and where the UN works with specific religious leaders, it tends to be limited to a particular issue or subject at a particular point in time. The UN Development Group is a number of different UN entities, like the World Bank Group, like UNDP, like UN Women, like UNICEF, who all work in different areas of development, but they largely work with governments, for governments, or with secular civil society, or with religious leaders. So I realized that our understanding had to encompass for sure religious leaders, but it had to focus on the religious development counterparts, so that they could also see, my colleagues in the UN system could see this other incredibly diverse, very critical sector of religious engagement that was people who were committed to strategic plans, to audits, to fundraising, to monitoring and evaluation, people who spoke in many ways a very similar language to that which we used in the UN. So there was already a common ground between the religious and the secular. And that is, quite frankly, the religious NGOs. So we were deliberate about reaching out to know who we were already working with at the country office level, which religious NGOs we were working with, how that work was going about. But the second thing I was determined that we do was to also acknowledge that these counterparts that we were inviting to our table and going to theirs eventually, as the religious NGOs themselves became more affirmed in their own sense of identity and outreach of the UN system, they sought us as UN counterparts with them in their spaces. But to do so always with the assumption that we were peers. No one was grander or more educated or more powerful than the other. When I and my colleagues sat across the table with our religious NGO counterparts, we sat and shared that table as peers, as equals, in a space of development. Nobody had all the answers. And I think that particular form of deliberate humility was in and of itself rather new to the UN general culture, where there's a sense of, perhaps a certain sense of arrogance, if you'll allow me to say that. That was the experience of working in the United Nations over a decade of consolidating our learning within the UN system and eventually also responding to the needs that emerged after 10 years of systematic, sustained, almost monthly, different kinds of meeting with different religious actors, a sustained engagement, right? That eventually led to many of our religious NGO actors telling us, how often are you going to keep on convening us and having these meetings and doing all this talking? Why don't you actually get us to advise you on what you're doing? When it comes to all these different agendas that we both are working on, the Sustainable Development Goals agenda, why don't we advise you? Why don't you seek us to be advisors to you in how you do this work as UN system entities? Which made perfect sense. So we then basically, all the different UN entities who are members of the Interagency Task Force nominated 2 to 3 of their most trusted religious NGO partners. The criteria was that they had to be religious NGOs, whom if anyone had a problem with Organization X and would come and face any one of us in the UN system and say, how dare you bring this organization on board, we would be able to defend that organization's record, and we would have evidence to show that that organization partnered with us honorably and they do their work well. So we had to make sure that those we recommended to the space that was going to be our advisory space, we had to make sure that we could defend them. We had to make sure that we could attest to their good track record of working with most of us as UN system entities in many parts of the world. A list of about 200 such NGOs eventually got whittled down to 40 NGOs, because we couldn't have an interagency task force with 22 UN entities with 150 people on its advisory council. So we got it down to 40 religious NGOs who were working with all of us in different capacities, who had a great track record of working with the UN system on so many different issues, who could speak to any of the Sustainable Development Goals agendas from their different perspectives, and who were multi-religious and international in nature and orientation. And that became the Multi-Faith Advisory Council. So, second part, what did we learn, and what were some of the challenges but also opportunities that were presented to us in this space? I'll share one learning with you very honestly. When we opened the door to engagement with our partners and other faith-based actors, we opened the door perhaps a little too wide, which one has to do if one needs to be radically inclusive, which I still believed in at that time and I still believe in now. But what it meant was that actually, on the good side, today it's perfectly normal to work with religious NGOs. Perfectly normal to partner and to celebrate the partnership with different religious NGOs. It is also, unfortunately, relatively normal for some of these NGOs to begin to dictate the terms of their engagement. Most of those terms are perfectly fine and honorable and decent and just. Some of them are not necessarily respectful of human rights. Let me rephrase that. Some of the religious NGOs don't believe in the fact that human rights are universal and interdependent and indivisible. They much prefer what I call cherry-picking human rights. We'll work on that one and this one, but we don't really work on that one. The minute you start cherry-picking which human rights you intend to uphold, that's when the entire human rights agenda becomes under threat. And when the entire human rights agenda comes under threat, authoritarianism, arrogance reign. Because the mechanism of keeping us all accountable to international human rights law becomes very difficult to uphold. The minute we start cherry-picking which rights matter more than others, that's the minute when we start to actually decide which human beings matter more and which aspects of certain human beings' lives matter more. And there's a problem inherent in that. A very serious problem inherent in that cherry-picking of human rights. So one of the lessons I have learned is that many of our religious NGO counterparts do prefer to cherry-pick which human rights they deem most worthy of their time and their partnership with the UN system. The other challenge that emerged was to realize that some of these religious NGOs would come to the table with conditions. If you're going to work on this and this set of issues, we won't work with you on that and that set of issues, or in that country. And we realized that the conditionality that we often complain about from donors, from donor governments, because donors come with conditions, of course, but we often can complain about conditionality by donors, do we not? At least those people like myself who come from the developing world, who've traditionally been recipients of donor funds and goodwill, have often complained that the donor funds and goodwill come with some strings attached, and some of those strings can be a bit difficult to stomach. Well, so what is it like when the religious partners also come with some strings attached to the partnership? It immediately impacts on that idea that we were so diligent about, which is that we're creating a common peer-to-peer space. When some peers decide to prioritize certain things and tell us what to do and what not to do, we are imbalancing that particular relationship of peers. We are prioritizing not only certain human rights and cherry-picking, but we are also impacting on the balance of power that is fundamentally required for successful development and humanitarian intervention. It is also, quite frankly, the balance that the Women, Peace and Security agenda is supposed to be aiming at sorting out and making sure that we can get back to balance. Because there is no such thing as security without peace or peace without security. Similarly, there really is no such thing as being able to secure peace and security without attending not only to the concerns of women, women's issues, as one hears plentifully, as if women exist separate from men, but there is no peace and security without the active participation, collaboration, and enrichment of men, women, and all genders in any particular context. There is no security for any man if there is one woman in threat. There is no security for any man or woman when another gender identity is under threat. It's just basic. It really isn't rocket science. It's basic. And it's one of the things, by the way, that our COVID dynamic is teaching us. COVID isn't discriminating between black or white or northern or southerner. COVID is impacting on everyone. It's hurting us all. So one of the many incredible lessons that COVID is teaching us is that to discriminate is really a bit silly, because ultimately the security of one, the harm done to one, will hurt and harm many others. And I think that particular idea, that particular lesson of COVID, that we all hurt if one of us is hurt, that's a very powerful lesson for the Women, Peace and Security agenda. But it's a lesson that's already integrated into the Security Council Resolution 1325, which makes it absolutely clear you don't do peace and security without women, right? And you don't do peace and security without gender and gender equality. So how do we work that back to our religious collaboration? And in what way can religion actually be used as a positive thing to advance the situation of women in conflict? Well, let me share a few things that I think actually are happening thanks to COVID. We cannot use religion for anything. People's faith is not a commodity. People's faith is the most sacred of sacred temples within. What we can do is partner, is listen to religious leaders, religious organizations. What we can do is integrate the religious infrastructure of our civil society into the secular infrastructure. What we can do, what we must do, is to honor deliberately, systematically, a vibrant civil society space. Fight for a vibrant civil society space. The vibrance will be built on the difference and the diversity of the components of a civil society. For the longest time, we assumed that civil society was a secular space. Well, guess what? It's always included the religious sectors. It is no longer possible to speak of a civil society that is not inclusive of the multi-religious. And that's the second thing. We have to strengthen civil society spaces by including and integrating religious actors in those spaces. Right? The second thing, which one leads to, when you have a vibrant civil society space, you actually are having to deal with diversity. That's why it's vibrant. Diversity is not just the diversity of secular and the diversity of religious voices. It is the fact that they can come together. So far, we have, in Western Europe in particular, very vibrant civil societies that is looked up to by the rest of the world. Is it not true? Let's hope it is. But you know something? The religious sectors aren't that well included. And where they are included in the so-called Western Hemisphere secular civic spaces, it's usually the Christian parts, the dominant, the majority. And that's not right. That's not right at all. Because the inclusivity, the radical inclusivity that our life today demands has to be an inclusivity not only of one religious voice or one religious institution, but of all. Just as we demand that gender equality has to be the equality of all gender identities. Similarly, a powerful civil society has to be the inclusion of all the religious together with all the secular, but all the religious. COVID has taught me another lesson that I wish I had never learned, and I wish I had never lived to learn, which is that just as every single religious organization has struggled and is struggling to deliver on the needs, the very, very, very necessities of many people in every society, every single religious institution has ramped up its scale of service to all communities like no other time during this pandemic. But you know what? I'm not sure who's working together. I'm not sure which religious institutions are actually working together. I haven't seen many examples of religious organizations working together to deliver to the same communities. And that's something we have to do, because if a global pandemic doesn't make us change our territorial ways of looking and acting and behaving as people of faith, and quite frankly, I'm not sure anything ever will. And you know something? The peace and security agenda cannot be realized by every single religious institution working superbly. The peace and security agenda can be realized when you have a vibrant civil society that includes a vibrant, multi-religious, collaborative sector. If any of you have any questions or doubts about why some of the most hurtful ideologies are today normal, if any of you have any doubts about that, let me tell you that one of the main reasons why hurtful discourse and action is normal is because those who believe that hurtful should be the norm are working very closely together in spite of their differences. Whereas ironically, those who believe that hurtful should never be normal can't really be found working collaboratively in the religious space. So, to make a long story short, we want to serve the gender peace and security agenda. We want to honor the gender peace and security agenda. We work collaboratively together across our religious differences, across our regional differences. We work multi-religiously, determinedly. And we do so with our secular civil society counterparts. We must be determined to be radically inclusive of all that is good. We must be determined to be radically inclusive of service to, with, and for one another, regardless of any difference, especially regardless of the religious differences, because we will not build a society that has any form of peace, let alone any form of security, if we're each looking for our individual securities. And whether that individual is Catholic or Christian, or Catholic or Protestant or Muslim or Hindu or Buddhist or Jewish, I'm sorry, if every single one of those is actually secure because they share a society together, they are not secure in their individuality. They are secure in their collective, determined existence to be socially cohesive. It is high time that we think of how we can do this and work deliberately together. And frankly, it's what every single faith tradition has always maintained. It's what every single divine message has always contained. We're created diverse, absolutely. We're not created diverse so that we can become exclusive of one another, but we're created diverse so that we can become stronger with one another. And that is at the heart of the Women, Peace and Security agenda.